So before we get going, I want to introduce Adam Erlinson from Parametrics. They were kind enough to be the session sponsor tonight, and he has just a few words to share.
Thank you, Katie. Hi, I'm Adam with Parametrics. We're really happy and honored to be the session sponsor tonight for this panel. Really looking forward to hearing the different thoughts and ideas that everybody's going to be bringing up. It's a very big issue for our community, and I think we're all here tonight to with that understanding that this is important to us all. So with that, thank you.
Thanks very much, Adam, and thanks to Parametrics for sponsoring tonight. So as we were putting tonight together, Carolyn Fitchett, I saw you. Where are you? Raise your hand. Right over there. Carolyn was a really great resource for putting the speakers together tonight, really brainstorming what we could do to bring out some creative solutions that are out there in the market right now to talk about. So thank you, Carolyn, and to all of our panelists. And let me just set this up a little bit for tonight. So we all know there's a housing crisis. This isn't any news. What tonight is about is what is it that we can do with buckshot rather than a bullet? So instead of trying to figure out one solution for affordable housing or for full spectrum housing, just plain simple old inventory, and not even getting into the affordability issue even, but including that, what is it that we can do that's creative, that's breaking the paradigms down of how home ownership actually happens out there, how things are being built, what are the costs, why are we in this bind, and what creatively can we do together to get us out of it? So it's not one thing, it's going to be many things, and that's what this panel represents tonight, and I'm really excited to hear their stories. So in 2018, it's widely known that Bend alone is about 5,000 units short for the folks that live here. In 2018, there were 32.8 new housing units permitted per month per 100 residents. So this year, we're right around 38 to 40. I heard from Carolyn, I think we're at 42 this month in Bend. I heard that this month we had 74 permits issued in Deschutes County wide. So what this says is, let me give you an example. In the 1990s, which was non-boom period, Deschutes County averaged around 42 building permits for every 100 new people come here. We're not even building that consistently. We're still under 40 on average. So essentially the bottom line is we are not even building enough for the people who are moving here, much less those of us who are here already and want to move to somewhere else. Unless you guys make some deals in the room tonight and saying, if you move out of your house, I'll move into yours, and then you move over there. It's really tough out there. So that's why we're here. So increasing inventory, finding affordable new types of pathways for home ownership and just for finding a home, that's what we're talking about tonight. And to moderate tonight's panel is the fabulous Carolyn Egan. She is the Economic Development Director for the City of Bend. She also, with Lynn, who is also here tonight, runs the Affordable Housing Program. And I'm an inch deep and a mile wide on this. She's an inch deep or not an inch deep, but a mile deep and a mile wide on this type of topic. So I've asked her to moderate the panel and to generate a little bit of discussion afterwards. And then we'll go out to the audience. And I'll let you kick it off, Carolyn.
Great. Thank you so much, Katie. Thank you all for being here. This is actually one of the best crowds I've seen at What's Brewing, so thank you for taking your time. And there's a rumor about a basketball game. Basketball's not our sport, so thank you for being here instead of at home watching the basketball game. So for the City of Bend, we've been tackling affordable housing since the early 2000s, really have led the state in being quite innovative about how we can build affordable housing in Bend, and then with our newest UGB expansion, really forward thinking about how we can get all needed housing on the ground in Bend. And our council has set a very aggressive goal of 3,000 new units over the next 2 years in the City of Bend. So, but in order to do that, we really need to look at the entire spectrum. I think a lot of times when people get together for What's Brewings and other events about building housing in Bend, we tend to really just focus on housing costs. How do we drive down the cost of housing? And now we're not really in a position to just be talking about that anymore. We need to start talking about what is it from the very first conversation that someone who owns land might be doing to talk to a bank about what it would be like to turn that land into housing, all the way to the end of what it takes to get a family, whether it's a rental unit or their family wants to buy a unit, into housing. And we are going to have to disrupt every single piece of that spectrum if we want to get 3,000 housing units in the city of Bend, but if we want to house everybody who lives in our community. So Jeff Harris is going to kick it off. He is much more of an expert than I am about what all of those costs are, and then we're going to follow up with some great panelists. So, Jeff.
Thank you, Carolyn. I'm Jeff Harris. I'm the Regional Director for Hayden Homes here in Central Oregon. I've got 45 minutes worth of regression analysis we're going to go through, so make sure you have a fresh drink. I'm going to use the first 7 of my 5 minutes as quickly as I can. So the role that I'm going to play here is to talk a little bit about how we evaluate costs and how we evaluate a project before we go forward. I don't think I need to tell you that the median home price in April in Bend hit $463,000, and the affordability range that we evaluate, that I'll show you how we get there in a minute, is closer to $317,000. So that's almost $150,000. Can I just talk? I decided to use the mic all on my own with no help. Just about every housing solution we're going to talk about tonight has to do with supply, because what we have is a supply problem. So with that, I'll get to it. I did not figure out how to hold a microphone, my notes, and a clicker all at once, so bear with me, please. Scarcity is what drives price up when you have a supply problem. It doesn't matter what you do to demand. It doesn't matter what you do to people's ability to afford it. The price simply goes up because there's not enough of it. And this is true nationwide, not just in Central Oregon. Harvard published a gigantic study last year that says exactly that. So you're welcome. I read it for you because you already know what's going on. As a production home builder, I think production home builders as a group are uniquely positioned to address this. 1, because we have volume experience, and 2, because it's our job to focus on cost. A custom home builder fills a need in the market, but they might not know their costs when they start building. We have to know our costs because we put a price on the street on day 1. And we value engineer a small number of floor plans so that we can value engineer them and use them regularly. And that's why I think we can find some market-based solutions. We have a design that we're working with the municipalities around Central Oregon where we can actually show density that approaches multifamily density, but you have a house and a yard because it's a smaller house, and the trade-off is you're not living in an apartment building. The planners who do housing needs analysis for the cities will tell you what the city needs is multifamily. The American dream may not be built around multifamily. It's part of the journey to the American dream, but it may not be the only solution, and that's why we think we've got something unique that we can offer here. The challenge we have is sometimes we tend to point to the government and say, fix this for us. Well, this is an industry problem that we think the industry can solve, and we can take the market part of it so that the limited government resources can go to those who truly need it. We can hit housing that is more affordable, closer to affordability as the market, and then focus the government resources on things that are where there's even less affordability, lower parts of the area median income. The way we do that as low-cost providers is really driving down to the nail, the 2x4, the value engineering it down to using the same water heater in every one so you can buy more of them, really limiting options, which is a valuable part of the home building market. The way I look at it is we have low-cost providers, we have differentiators. Costco is a low-cost provider, Nordstrom is a differentiator. They both serve an important part of the market. But when we have a supply problem, we need more of it. We need 5-gallon buckets of houses. We don't need bespoke homes as much as we need more of them. So I'm going to take you through the home building, production home building cost model here. I do have I'm sorry that it's a pie chart and not a bar graph. So we break it down into a very simple slice, 4 slices of pie. The largest slice is the direct cost. That's going to be your sticks and bricks. Oh, I'm going to go in a different order here. Indirect costs are your sales, marketing. It's really everything that might fall into overhead, but there are a lot of things that it takes to build the house in the field. And then we have land costs, which is acquisition, entitlement, engineering, development, financing, offsites, bonds, warranties. It all adds up. So a paper lot in Bend, there's paper lots in Bend listed right now for $50,000. That is the dirt before you entitle it or put any pipe in the ground to make it into a house. That makes for a very expensive value proposition. And then for directs, this is the permits and the sticks and the bricks. When it comes to this, financing is a large variable really in both indirects for the builder. We have to borrow the money to build the house, and then our revenue point is 6 to 12 months down the line, at which point you pay off your loans and you have a slice of the pie left for you. And the higher each of these inputs get, the smaller the slice of making the project pencil gets. So as we mentioned, with a $463,000 median home price, when we apply our home building model to this, we end up needing a lot that costs around $93,000. There are no $93,000 lots in Bend. There are barely any in Redmond, but the house price in Redmond wouldn't support that expensive of a lot. So then the way Hayden Homes looks at every market that we enter or that we serve is we start with the median household income, because that's the middle point of the market. That's where the most people earn. That's the amount that most people in the community earn. What that allows us to do then is to do a couple of assumptions about the type of loan and the interest rate, and we back into a sales price of $317,000 in Bend. And that would require a lot that costs for dirt, entitlement, and infrastructure $63,000. And I know you know that it's not good. I just want you to know how not good it is, I guess. Well, here's an interesting thing. We have a community in Bend right now where this is really close to our average price. But the way we did it was by accepting 1 or 2% in margin, as opposed to the 6% in our model. And the risk there is higher. We screw up one thing, we need to replace one furnace, we need to redo one driveway, it's gone. And we choose to do this because it's built into our business model. We have a business model that not only focuses on cost, serving the median income, but we also have free market philanthropy built into our business model so that we are giving as we go through the community. And part of our choice is to say we're willing to take that risk so that we can offer a home as close as possible to what the median income can afford. The challenge is it's one community right now, and that's not going to add the thousands of units that we need in Central Oregon before the next 20 years is up. So the community is called Butler Crossing. We have smaller single-story homes on your own lot. And what's also cool there is we're building rental homes that are cottage style. So they range from 600 to 1,000 square feet. Some of them have garages, some of them don't. They're just getting finished now. On your way home, you can go west on Butler Market here and check it out. It looks awesome, and it's a great way. And this is the horizontal density that we know we can add. And the building code related to the type of housing that we build is much more achievable than vertical density. Because vertical density, you have a lot related to fire suppression and things that are necessary when you build it that dense, but it's very, very expensive. So we want to be really careful about that. So my point, I guess, is we think that a partnership with the municipalities where we can figure out a way to adjust the code so that we can build more housing faster is one of the best ways we can meet the supply problem that we have, because even though population is growing and even though demand is there, permits and starts are not going up. In some cases, they're going down, and this is a nationwide problem. And we're trying to come up with something that bridges the gap between what the planners say we need and what the builders can build cost efficiently.
And so development code changes are music to my ears as economic development director.
Absolutely. My final shameless plug is today, Hayden Watson, our CEO, he received the Hearthstone Award, which is home building's most prized philanthropy award. And it's based on what we do through First Story, which is our in-house, our homegrown public nonprofit that has to date delivered 77 homes to families that wouldn't otherwise have them, and we've donated over $20 million in our 30 years to the communities where we build, and we look forward to doing even more than that with your help. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So that sets the scene perfectly. I think if you could go back, can you go back to your pie chart, Jeff? Okay, so Jeff talked about some examples about how Hayden is disrupting parts of this market, and the rest of our speakers, Stan and Michael and Patrick, are each going to talk about what their organizations are doing to further innovate in all of these pieces. So I'm going to let them go through. They each have about 5 to 8 minutes to speak. We have 2 questions that we're going to hand to the panel to get the conversation going, and then the rest of this night is really up to you guys to carry this conversation so that we can really see what would work in our community or what other things we ought to be talking about in Central Oregon. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Stan.
Does this work? Well, Katie told me that she was serious about her 8-minute time limit, so I had to put my beer on the back wall and switch to water. And I'm going to try to cut through some of this. Do you have my slides? Yeah. Great. So New Deal housing. What's a New Deal? We think that there needs to be a new deal between landlords and tenants that recognizes the fact that tenants are the ones who provide all the cash flow that float projects. And I speak that as having been a landlord since I was 19. So let's go to the next. Oh, I get to go to the next slide. Okay, we all know that America's made a huge investment in building the middle class in this society. And we've done that starting back with the Homestead Act all the way through the GI Bill. And that investment has paid off. It's paid off with stable families, stable communities, stable economy, and a stable democracy. Yeah, I struggled over that. We also know that today there's a lot of confusion and debate over what constitutes middle class. And the reason I think that there's debate about that and confusion about that is because there are 2 components to being middle class. One is earning a middle class income that's sufficient to supply a comfortable everyday lifestyle, sort of like the Romans gave the citizens bread and circuses to keep them peaceful. The other is building middle class wealth that creates resiliency and the ability to respond to crises and take on opportunities like helping the next generation. Today, we have a situation in which a big chunk of our population earns a middle class income but cannot generate middle class wealth. And I think that is actually a threat to democracy long term, so an important issue in and of itself. Many of those people pay more in rent than they would have to as a home mortgage if they could get into a home. We're talking about teachers and nurses, for example. If they were born when I was born, they'd have a house, no problem. It's a shift in our economy, and it has nothing to do with housing. It has to do with income distribution, and we can't solve that here today, so we'll talk about coming about it the other way. Where are we? Why has that happened? Well, that's happened primarily because of down payment. Most renters identify the down payment as the primary barrier to purchasing a house. And the reason that millennials, this is who I looked at, this doesn't only apply to them, but the reason that millennials don't save enough for down payment is that they can't. Look at those stats up there about the basics, food, housing, and healthcare cost them 20% more of their income today than it did my generation. That's not even beginning to talk about student debt or the basic new necessities like having a cell phone, having a data plan, being engaged in society. Those aren't even factored into that. So we've created a set of wage earners who have no chance to become wealth builders. And that doesn't just hurt them, it hurts their families and their communities and our societies. So, and it's a nationwide problem, as Jeff was saying. Come on. The darker the color, the bigger the disparity in in incomes versus the cost of housing. And I totally agree with Jeff. We need market-based solutions that are replicable to address this problem. And the reason we do is because we have a scarce amount of public resources, and none of us want to be engaged in a debate to whether those public resources go to deal with homelessness or they don't go to deal with the recreation of the middle class. And I believe there are market-based solutions that can address this problem. The one we have in mind is this new deal between landlords and tenants. And essentially the principles of the new deal are that the tenants get to earn a portion of the equity during their tenancy. And essentially about 50% of the equity growth is going to the tenant and about 50% to the landlord or investor. All the other costs, the development costs, the land, everything else are at market. We're just talking about the investor making a concession. Whether or not it's actually a concession depends on what you think the risk-adjusted and impact-adjusted return ought to be. The weaknesses in this system are, one, it does not address anybody but those who can already afford to pay market rent. Okay, it depends on that. Two, it's appreciation dependent, so it only works in communities that are growing. This model that you see here assumed 3% annual appreciation, which was, we had Eco Northwest give us a forecast for the metropolitan areas in Oregon, and that they've got a 20-year forecast assuming 3% annual average. You got to write it up and down. And what it produces for the renter at the end of 8 years, which we're assuming is full term, and we refi there, is the ability to pay 10% down on a $670 some odd $1,000 house, or 15% down on a $448,000 house. We have a get out early program, which essentially means they have to sell their rent credit at a discount to an investor who's going to take the risk that it's actually going to come out the back end. But even with that, at 5 years, somebody could get out with a 6% down, and the reality is 70% of the people in the United States who are first-time home buyers are putting down 6% or less. So is this a replicable market-based solution? I believe that entirely hinges on whether or not we can find investors willing to accept an 8% return. And who is going to be willing to accept an 8% return? Number one, impact investors. Investors who have an interest in... okay, thank you. Right. Who are interested in doing more with their investment, being interested in not having to live in a gated community with guards 20 years from now, or their children live in that environment, and they're interested in what investing in the society along with investing in their own personal wealth. Employers. Do we have a problem with housing for nurses? Yeah. Local small-scale investors. Using Reg A Plus, which has been out for about 3 years now, which allows unaccredited investors to participate where they didn't used to participate, allows us to offer an 8% return to people who are not used to having access to those sorts of returns with as low a risk as this postures. Is my time up?
You have one more. Wrap up. You're good.
Okay. What did I forget to say? I'll handle the rest in questions. Thanks.
So it's great. We talk about how do we bring employers into the market, and I think Stan has just given us a great example. And then we'll hold all the questions to the end. So I'm going to hand it over to Michael.
I'm next. Well, Jeff and Stan covered a lot of the ground. I was hoping I'd just be able to slink off and watch the Blazers, but it didn't really work out like that. I think the piece that hasn't come into the mix yet is really the affordable housing piece that I work on. So I'm a program officer at Meyer Memorial Trust. We're a large private foundation. We fund all sorts of good things all over the state of Oregon to the tune of about $30 million a year, which sounds like a lot until you start thinking about how much does it cost to build a building. And then you realize in the housing side, we spend about $8 million a year on grants. That doesn't go very far. So we fund a lot of different things. We fund services to keep people in housing. We do gap financing in capital projects. And one of the more interesting things we can do is fund risky, unproven new ideas, which is, I guess, why I'm here to talk to you a little bit tonight. I should warn you, I'm not really a deep expert in any of this. I've never got a building out of the ground myself. I don't build single-family homes. I can read a pro forma. I know just enough to be dangerous in this conversation. But I spent a lot of time wrestling with the costs of affordable housing development with a group of experts over about a year and a half, producing a report. I think we linked to it in the resources page that you have available. And we really dove into what are the things that make it so expensive to develop new housing. We were mostly focused on multifamily affordable housing, and I should say when I say affordable housing, we generally in the housing wonk world mean people making up to about 80% of the median family income, so that probably gets you into the nurses and firefighters and teachers category. Obviously, there's some focus, too, on very low-income folks. I think one of the big light bulb moments for me in this work was almost 20 years ago when somebody explained to me, if you're on Social Security or you're living on SSI disability, what you could pay as an affordable rent doesn't even cover the operating costs of the unit for your landlord. Won't even pay for the insurance and taxes and maintenance of that unit. So it's not that landlords are terrible, greedy people. It's that you literally can't break even serving people at a very low income. So affordable housing is a really weird, wacky business. You're providing a service to customers who can't afford the price of the service. And I think that leads you directly into a discussion about the role of government and subsidy. And so I think that's the place to start with understanding why affordable housing is really expensive or can look really expensive. It's a completely different animal than market rate housing development. There are a lot of things that are the same. So the land cost, the cost of labor market, the cost of materials, the cost of getting your project through permitting and approvals from the local jurisdiction, all that's very much like a for-profit market-based development. But the minute you take a public dollar to help fill your gap in your pro forma, that dollar, of course, and you would expect this, comes with all kinds of strings attached. You have to meet a bunch of restrictions and requirements. You have to document that you're meeting those requirements, maybe for 30 years, maybe in Portland for 60 years. That's not free. You may have to do a bunch of extra things that the city or the county or the state requires you to do because you're taking that. For instance, things like meeting prevailing wage, that's a really big deal. All of a sudden, you've just added 20% to your labor costs because you have to meet prevailing wage, and you have to document that you've met prevailing wage. So it's a very different business. And then as we got into this work and really started understanding the complexity of it, a whole bunch of other things popped up that I hadn't known very well before. These deals are so complicated. If you do a low-income housing tax credit deal, it's like a tiny little jewel box, handcrafted deal every time. It's not a standardized, uniform thing where you can just go crank out units one after another. It's like dozens and dozens of people work for hundreds of hours to get you 40 units, 50 units. And that economy of scale is a really big deal because your legal costs on a 40-unit building aren't very much different from your legal costs on a 300-unit apartment building, but you're spreading them across 40 units, so the per-unit cost is going to look really high. So there are nuances like that. The scale thing is a really big deal. And of course, you wouldn't want to go into Prineville and build a 300-unit complex. People probably aren't going to do that for a variety of really good reasons. So there are not crazy reasons that affordable housing projects tend to be a little smaller. The other thing that I think we didn't make crystal clear in the report that I've been thinking about since the report came out is it's a very different mindset. You have all these partners involved. I think if you're a market rate developer, the number of partners is a lot smaller. You can be a lot more nimble. Everybody knows with clarity what the other partners want. In an affordable deal, you might have a dozen partners. If one of them wants to change one paragraph in one of the documents, the other 11 partners have to go back to their lawyer. And it puts you in a situation, and a bunch of these partners are really risk averse. So they're government agencies. They're lenders who have very strict and very rigid requirements about what they expect in a deal. So you get this layer upon layer of risk management that bakes in on the front end kind of a risk management strategy for all these partners. Everybody anticipates the worst possible outcome, and that gets factored in and piled on and layered into the deal in a way that would seem like utter madness to a for-profit developer. That's something I think very few people really understand well, and that makes them look expensive. I mean, there's a thing called capitalized operating reserves. When we explained this to our market rate developers on the deal, they were like, you do what? You take a pile of money and you sit it in the bank in case your vacancy is a little higher than you expected. That's crazy, and that is crazy, but that's how you do a tax credit deal. So we discovered a lot of the issues, and I think really in this context, I want to focus on things we do have control over. We don't have control over the price of land. We don't have control over the really out of control labor market and the construction costs. We don't have a lot of control over the strings that come with government money, and some of those strings come with it for a good reason. So let's focus on the things we do have control over, and some of those are design and construction efficiencies, and some really good work has been done on that. Some of those are really going back to the public partners and talking in real talk about some of the public requirements. Why are you requiring so much parking? What about the offsites? Is there a way that we can rethink the required offsites? Can we look at different designs that might not be allowed now? Things like cottage clusters or single room occupancy. We sort of wandered away from single room occupancy for very low income tenants, and I don't really understand why. Maybe Patrick knows better than I do. And then, you know, the other thing that I almost hesitated to say in the report, but I thought it was important to make it clear, is the public funders don't really incentivize low cost, because there are all these other things they incentivize, and they may give you points for bringing in units at a lower cost, but that sort of gets lost in the shuffle. It's really hard, and I think takes some real nuance and creativity to incentivize lower costs in a way that makes sense. And you have to be really careful cutting corners. Part of the reason we ended up where we ended up is we made a lot of mistakes as an industry in the 90s and had to go back and fix a lot of buildings that weren't built properly, and we paid more in the long run than we should have paid because we tried to cut corners on the outset. I'll just wrap up. How many more minutes do I have?
Left.
Brilliant. I can do this in a minute. So we funded a couple rounds of pilots, and I'm happy to talk more about those as we get into the Q&A, but some of them were really about design and construction efficiencies and really optimizing, really focusing relentlessly on cost reduction there. Several projects we funded worked with Walsh Construction, which is a big general contractor in Portland. Walsh has been great about sharing their special sauce about how they've really focused on driving down the per unit cost in design and construction. We funded some work on tiny home villages, which I never thought I would put money into and still have some questions about, but we've worked with Square One Villages out of Eugene, which is doing some really interesting work with self-governed communities in tiny homes. And their latest project in Eugene, if you get a chance to go look at it, are really nice homes. They're just really, really small, and they've drawn on a well of community support to make that community happen in a way that's really interesting. The latest stuff we're working on, I think one of the projects I'm most excited about overlaps a little bit with Patrick's work, involves modular accessory dwelling units to be placed in the backyards of lower income homeowners in Portland, which will help both the homeowner with the rent stream and a tenant that can move in there who otherwise might really have a hard time affording a place to live in Portland. With that, I think that's a good place for me to stop. The one other thing I wanted to mention that I almost forgot in my notes. So I'm on the grant making side. We have a whole investment side, the people who work with the real pile of money at Meyer and try and make it bigger every year so we can give out more next year, are really interested in this issue of affordable housing. And we are in the early stages of developing a real estate investment trust targeted to supporting affordable housing. It's probably going to be really focused on Portland for the foreseeable future, but it's a really interesting idea, and I think overlaps some with what Stan was talking about finding this sweet spot of socially motivated investors who will accept that 8% return and a social return on investment, and really help housing stay affordable over the long term, sort of take it out of that cycle of market speculation. So I'm really excited about that as well. Look forward to your questions.
Is this on? There we go. So my name is Patrick Quinton. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Dweller. We're developer of prefab accessory dwelling units. And before I get into what we do, I just want to start. Does everyone know what an accessory dwelling unit is? Show of hands if you know what an ADU is. All right, so good. We can start off with that assumption. So I think, as you know, accessory dwelling units, they actually begin to address some of the issues that you've heard tonight, well, starting with the cost of land, but they represent another housing option that we can add into the mix that takes advantage of existing property that we wouldn't otherwise develop. But more importantly, they also represent, in some respects, the evolution of housing and how we think of housing. So it's not just that it's less expensive to develop in your backyard. It's that you may actually want to develop in your backyard because you want a parent to live there or a child to live there, or maybe you want the extra income, and Airbnb and other things have proven that you can make income off of what used to be just a place to live. And so we are seeing this evolution of housing, and ADUs are kind of right in the kind of front and center in that conversation. And then the other big thing, and hopefully everybody knows, is ADUs are now, certainly in the state of Oregon, state of California, state of Washington, they're legal everywhere. They are legal in any residentially zoned land. Now there's other issues, fees, kind of hurdles sometimes, but that wasn't the case even 2 or 3 years ago. So now this formerly very small opportunity is now turned into a big opportunity. So my partner and I created Dweller a few years back because we were looking at the ADU market. We saw all of these dynamics at work, the opportunity, but we were also seeing that the ADU industry was plagued by a lot of things that was preventing it from really taking hold. And those issues really were cost. So ADUs have become too expensive for your typical homeowner, and so that was keeping a lot of people from taking it on. Secondly, they actually, where they were legal, they're a hassle. So we were basically asking amateur developers, otherwise known as homeowners, to become experts, right? To become experts in permitting and managing contractors, and even going off and finding the financing. So we had that was an obstacle. And then lastly, still kind of an issue, was the lack of financing. So we had a form of housing that made economic sense, financial sense. We either rental income or people had a need for it, and yet there was no financing really to facilitate that. Certainly not the way that we expect across other parts of the real estate world. So we set out to create a business that would address those primary challenges, because our bigger goal was, how can we scale this? It's great that we have all these one-off do-it-yourself projects, a lot of really cool ADUs, but nothing was really scaling. We thought this is a business or a segment that should have more scalable businesses. We thought if we could address these issues, we could create a scalable model. So first thing we did was we said, how do we drive down the cost of ADUs? They're perfect for prefab or modular construction. So we build our ADUs 100% off-site. They're trucked in. We do very little actual work on the unit on site. It's all site prep and then finishing the site, doing utility connections. They get built, driven down the highway, and in many cases they're craned in. So if you can see this here, I don't know if that's a light, or I guess I went back. But anyway, so we oftentimes crane them in, but that unit that's flying over that house there is inside is the refrigerator and the stove and dishwasher, cabinets, bathtub. Everything is inside that unit. So this process dramatically lowers the cost and the time required to build an ADU. In Portland, we can do an all-in ADU for $130,000. I'm happy to report that as of this month, we are now open for business in Bend. So this product is also now available here as well. And then the other thing we did was we set out to try and address the financing issue. And while we have one experiment going on, the main thing we're doing is working with lenders to try and create targeted lending products. We actually have a flyer up front from one credit union. We're working with other lenders to try and develop standalone ADU financing, meaning financing that is not based solely on the existing home equity in your property. That's how most ADUs have been built in the past. If that's there, that's great, but that leaves out too many homeowners, and so we're working to develop targeted ADU financing to go with our units. But in Portland, we've also experimented with a ground lease, and I can talk about that later in the Q&A, but in that model, we've been building the ADU at our cost by leasing the backyard of a homeowner. We own the ADU, we rent it out, and we share the rent with the homeowner. That's another way to help bridge the financing gap that we're seeing in the marketplace. And so as a result, we think we have one option of scaling the adoption of ADUs. So this is a standardized 1 bedroom, 1 bath, 450 square foot unit. You can see in the inside it looks like an apartment. So this is a rentable unit, or it works obviously for as a mother-in-law suite or whatever. But we think it serves a big chunk of the market. But we also hope, as Mike was saying, that we want to push on things like modular, prefab, to get other scalable business models into this space, into other spaces, and to offer customers more choice, larger units, smaller units, and we'd like to be part of that solution. So with that, just want to thank everyone for coming and the opportunity to present here. As I mentioned, we are open for business in Bend. We have flyers on both the financing available and a card you can take as a way to contact us. And I'm certainly going to be around after to talk to anybody who has any questions. And if people want to give me your contact information, we're happy to take a look at properties for free. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. So that's a lot of new ideas, and I bet you have maybe a question or two. So I had some questions prepped for these guys, but based on the quality of the presentations and the depth that they went into, do I have any questions? Katie's not paying attention next to you. Do you have a microphone?
Okay, we have Karna's question.
Hi, Karna Gustafson. I'm Government Affairs for Central Oregon Builders Association. And one of the things you didn't necessarily touch on was one of the costs that goes into one of those of your pie chart, the cost, is the appeals by neighbors and the legal fees and trying to get the community to accept some of these products that you're talking about. Do you have solutions? Do you have thoughts about fixing development code, to deal with the notices and the persons that show up and say, yeah, but I used to have that vacant lot across from me, my kids played there, and now you're putting a house on it, or heaven forbid, you're putting a duplex or a triplex on it?
That's an easy one.
I'll just answer it from the narrow ADU perspective. One of the things that's really helped with the growth in ADUs is the by right changes to the zoning code. So in most communities now, if you have a residentially zoned property, you have by right the right to build an ADU within certain specifications, meaning certain size and whatnot, and so that provides a ton of certainty for the development of a certain type of ADU. And if people want to do special things, then they're taking on the additional hurdles. But the more that can be built into the code for different types of development that is by right, or that minimizes the type of appeal, I think you provide more certainty for developers and investors to pursue those. The uncertainty is almost it's harder to manage than cost. So it's really the uncertainty of the process that delays things.
Anyone else want to add? Stan?
Can you hear me? I think there's an opportunity to create a separation speaking to the same issues, the next line over when you hit variances. I spent 5 years on the Planning Commission in Portland, so I saw a fair number of this coming at me. I think there would be an opportunity, and it would be a hard fight, but to create a new category, we'll have to come up with a different name than variance, that allows some flexibility on minor issues and has lower process requirements for that flexibility.
So we have. I'll let you go first.
Hi, Kat Zwicker, Desert Sky Real Estate. I appreciate the preponderance of the focus on residential footprint, but what about actual workforce housing, a live-work environment where we might have a mixed use or the opportunity to have a walkability type lifestyle that none of this has touched upon?
All right, we're live. Hi, Kat. Kat and I were at the Planning Commission last night in Redmond. Thanks for serving on the commission. The way I've seen it done is where you really orient your density as close as possible to the services that you want. One of the, I think, feedback I have for the area plans and other things as the cities have grown is that you want to have from a planning standpoint, it sounds good to have little commercial things out in the, I'll call them suburbs, but a little farther from the city center. The problem with that is you need thousands and thousands of rooftops to serve the coffee shop, and it's always a coffee shop, a nail salon, a tanning place, and or something else. And then there's a part of the commercial that just fails over and over, right? And we have to figure out how to move our density to where the places are. Arlington, Virginia is an extremely urban county that I grew up near, and they planned it where the density is at the metro stops and the lower density is between on purpose so that they get a better outcome even though it's super dense to begin with. So it goes from dense to super dense. But I think that's the challenge is finding where do you put the density adjacent to the things that already exist so that you don't have to either create it or wait years and years and years for thousands of homes to be built so you have enough people to support the coffee shop that you wanted to have in there to walk to. We should talk about that.
Carolyn, the city has a couple of projects, urban renewal areas, that lead to the density that you're talking about, the walkable communities, the Central District, the South Elbow, or whatever the heck you're calling that. You want to talk about that?
What we called neighborhood commercial areas. And so rather than me having to always drive from my house over to Costco, that I would have an option that I wouldn't have to drive across town, so that some of those neighborhood services would not mean that everybody had to drive to Mirapon Cleaners, but there would be cleaners in the neighborhoods. What we saw, we've had those neighborhood commercial for a while. They hadn't been successful because exactly for what Jeff had talked about. You just don't have enough rooftops to support those types of commercial or retail uses. And so as we build out the UGB, we're really talking about complete communities so that everyone really does have an option to take a walking trip rather than always having to get in their car. And I had a next question from Mike Riley in the back.
This may be for you, mostly Jeff, but for the rest of the panel, I'm just curious if you have other specifics. You'd mentioned development code changes, so if you want to talk more about specific things in Bend that you think should be happening.
Nope, it's on. I'll give you a couple examples from around the state. Up the road in Redmond, we had in 2013 they enacted some architectural requirements, and it added thousands of dollars of cost to each home without a demonstrated benefit to the homeowners or the neighborhood. It was just sort of a feeling that they wanted houses to look different. And over in Hillsborough, they have a whole architectural requirement before you even can then go in for building permit. And I think over the last 50 years, we've sort of accidentally gotten ourselves with well-meaning individual codes into a situation where whether it's the UGB process or dev code or architectural requirements where we're creating more scarcity because it's just plain challenging. You know, one of the reasons it takes so long to get a building permit in Bend, even as a production builder, is somebody ahead of us drew something on a napkin you know, because they just didn't know what the process was, because the process is so darn complicated. And we don't want to create a cottage industry around just a limited number of consultants who know how to navigate this thing. We need to make it simpler, and that's where I think looking at the whole code instead of the little bits of the code, because every rule in the code is because something got screwed up in the past, right? Everything and every contract you sign is because somebody sued over it in the past, right? And somehow we have to figure out a way to say what's sensible is these things, and here's how we get there, and then give the staff some leeway as opposed to saying a prescriptive. Because if I, you know, I'm fortunate to lead an awesome team, but if I said, okay, the rule is take care of your customer, they say, well, what does that mean? And then I give them 5 more rules, and they say, well, what if they say this? And I say, give them more rules. We create a rule book this thick, and we're not thinking. And at the municipal level, we have to create, I think, an environment where we can say, this makes sense, and let's figure out how to fast track it because it's important to the community. So that's a very general answer, but I think it's the stacking of all these codes over the years where it's super complicated, and that doesn't, we're knuckle dragging home builders, like we can barely put stuff together. We better be able to understand how to get a building permit because it's got to get built.
Question?
Parking. That's mine.
Yes. Oh, parking.
Somebody?
Hi, everyone. Mike Bittner, Leadership Bend 2019 class, Tyler with the back row. And no, I'm not talking about parking. Jeff, you just mentioned a word that has been going off in my head called fast track, right? I've lived in communities that if we wanted to do something, we would fast track that community. Be it a green building project, you go to the top of the list. Affordable housing, you go to the top of the building permit stack, right? I'm curious to know, from the panel, you're all offering new things, right? What sort of innovative processes or programs have you run into at different regulating agencies, like cities, that have seemed particularly innovative to you, that have helped move along some of these projects?
Patrick, that wasn't your happy face.
I think my experience is limited to Portland, but I think it's important to recognize, I think fast track and all that stuff is great, and I think to the extent to which you have ways to prioritize the right projects or the projects you really want to see, I think that's great, but it just still does speak to the fundamental process. So we are, you know, building as many ADUs probably as anyone now in the city of Portland. We don't have a special process. We don't get treated differently, but we do the same thing every single time. So that's one of the innovations that we have is I submit the same permit package every time. My only desire is that the city treats it the same way every time. I don't need it treated special. I need it treated the same way every time, and they didn't. And it took them a long time, but now they do. And so my permit time, without cutting any corners, is now, it's well under 2 months. I can probably get things in 4 to 5 weeks, but it's because, you know, we work through all these things. So that's my expectation, and I don't think, at the end of the day, affordable housing absolutely should get priority if we truly are building, you know, truly affordable projects. But we should be treating all development that is by code, we should be treating it the same way. So it should really be how do we make the process as efficient as possible, get projects through as quickly as possible, and take away the uncertainty around the process. I don't understand. You? No.
Here, got it, Carolyn?
Stan, Ann George from Oregon Community Foundation. I'm just curious to learn more about the New Deal housing. Specifically, can you give me an idea of what a typical or ideal employer relationship might be with that New Deal housing? What is that equity participation for the employer versus and the employee, and what does that look like long term as the workforce is more and more mobile in terms of where they stay and who they work for?
Is this working? Yeah. Weak memory, I'm going to start with the last part of your question and go first. An aspect the way I presented that was all about generating a down payment. but in reality, it is allowing tenants to participate in equity generation, whether they ever buy a house or not. So that speaks to mobility, assuming you got market penetration with this and you had multiple units that were available. Which my experience with the market is if you offer people a better deal, eventually the market will move along with that because competition works. In terms of the structure of the participation of the employer, we have a piece of land here in Bend we'd love to do a demonstration project on that I got swept into another project we set aside. But in that vision, you've got a LLC owning the land. You have the general partner in the LLC is a not-for-profit. The LLC is not not-for-profits. There are tax benefits to the investors. And then we needed to have a conversation with employers about if you have as an employer, you have cash that you manage, cash reserves. What makes sense for you to put some of your cash reserves in this? I didn't specify this, but our model has us paying a 4% current return, so they're getting an annual current return of 4%. So it works from a cash reserve. I think it sustains a cash reserve. It was a little bit built around what we thought foundations might accept. And then a top-off terminal return that brings them up to 8%. There's no cap on it, but our model shows the 8%. So they're participating in the investment for the whole project. Now, whether or not we have to negotiate with employers for X number of units for their employees, how that plays out is, I haven't thought that through. I think we need to have those conversations, and from my point of view, it's fair game to negotiate that. If we're generating units that are enabling people to build wealth, I don't mind serving an employer who's willing to back it. Did that answer your question? Okay.
Got a question back here.
Hi, Michelle O'Hara with Zolo Media and Central Oregon Daily News. My question is, we've heard a lot about the Bend Central District and the vision for it. It's beautiful. As someone who was one of the first owners in the Pearl District in Portland, I see the vision that could happen here. I also remember back in that day, there were several developers who really it was a risky proposition, but they took that risk, it paid off. So my question is, do we have developers here in Bend that are interested in the plan and moving forward? And if so, why? If not, why?
Not even on the panel. So the core area, so the Bend Central area, when we're looking at the vision for what happens in that part of Bend, we've actually expanded it to go a little bit to the north into around Division and then south into Corpine, as many of you are familiar. But what we're looking at there is really, if you've driven through, you know that there's a lot of very small parcels. And so it is absolutely going to take some very, very forward-thinking developers to figure out how to assemble land and then put the type of housing on that's going to support that area. The urban growth boundary plan only assumed about 400 housing units out of that area by the end of the UGB timeline, which is 2028. I think to recognize some of the barriers that we're going to have to come over to do that. But absolutely, we have at least one prominent developer. Brooks Resources has invested in land in the core area. And we have 2 or 3 other developers who are on the other side of my voicemail on a regular basis, really making offers and trying to assemble property to figure out how to make projects in the core start to pop. Part of me, as the person responsible for this city's urban renewal, is like, just wait until we get urban renewal and then we get the tax increment. But that's selfish. Largely, we're trying to make sure that the market will provide the certainty, as many of the panelists have talked about. Developers really need certainty. And if the parking ratio is unknown, or really how the city is going to evaluate their land use proposal, it really stops people from putting forward good ideas. And so a lot of our obligation as we continue to plan for the core is to continue to increase that certainty. So I do believe that, I know we have 2 or 3 prominent developers who are lurking in the area, and I expect more to come on board as the plan becomes more and more well-known and certain for the market.
I can't identify any developers for you. I don't have enough time in Bend to know them. I can tell you from a cautionary tale from my time on the Portland Planning Commission as to why you ought to treat the Central District as an incredibly unique opportunity. I now sit around dinner tables with my friends and I hear them complain about the tall buildings on our neighborhood collector streets, a couple of which are mine, and how those impact the neighbors. Portland had to solve its density problem to deal with the urban growth boundary and get our plans past LUBA by putting density on neighborhood streets adjacent to single-family neighborhoods. That's tough. You have the opportunity in the Central District to do it entirely differently in Bend if the vision is big enough and you're willing to go boldly enough for what you put in there. And I really, actually, you may think it's selfish to say wait for urban renewal. If you're not building in your public spaces that will create the assets that allow you to have more density and people to feel more freedom in their public and commercial spaces that they don't get in their units, Central District is not the place to build horizontally. Central District is your opportunity to go not necessarily high rise, but to create some density and create services and take the pressure off which will hit the entire city if you don't grab that opportunity in the Central District to deal with your urban growth boundary problem. It will look like Portland in terms of that clash between high-rise or not mid-rise on neighborhood collector streets and residential communities.
And I think if we don't respond, the state at the legislative level is going to continue to change the rules so that we see what's happening in Portland potentially happen in other places if we don't find ways to build density in our community. So.
Okay, got another one back here.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks for being here, folks. For those of you that are for-profit organizations up front, I'm curious your feelings, good or bad. The new privilege tax, I assume those that are for-profit are doing more than $1 million a year up there in revenues. So if you're running on thin margins of 6% and we have a 0.56% tax on your revenues, how's that going to impact you? And is that going to be good or bad incentivizing new housing for underperforming, folks that don't make as much, or is it going to be bad? Which do you think?
So he's talking about the $2 billion tax for schools.
For Hayden Homes over here, and if you're running at a 6% profit on a $350,000 home, and then you're paying on that $350,000 home a 0.5%, that's $1,750. That's eating into 10% of your profit. What are you going to do about it?
I guess we'll go back to the subcontractors, and no, the reason we've opposed some of those poorly thought out, measures that have been defeated in the past was primarily because there's already not a lot to go around, and the first thing we think about is, we'll take the dent ourselves before we reduce what we do from a philanthropic standpoint, right? But there's a limit to that, right? We run lean, we have a very small team, but it's those types of things concern me because we know we have schools that are a big deal, right? We're not saying that's not something. We typically support bond measures and other ways to do it. We just have to figure out how to spread around the expense, just like we do when we talk about SDC changes and other revenue streams that the municipalities or the state needs. But thanks for doing the math for me, because deer in the headlights, you probably saw that. Thank you.
We're here to serve at the Bend Chamber of Commerce. Okay, one more question.
My name is Ken Katzeroff. I'm a land use attorney that mostly works in the county. And I kind of want to tie on a couple of things, and so just bear with me for a second. Stan, you mentioned something that was really important to at least the city of Bend, which is the UGB. But all of you have been talking about market forces, and I went house hunting with one of my good friends this weekend, and she said, hey, I want to have a single-family home with a reasonable lot size where I can have my dog outside, I can have a barbecue, I can park a car or two, good to go. Those are all market issues. But if we're engineering towards a UGB that doesn't necessarily allow you to do that anymore, is that something that needs to change? Should the state respond to market force there? Should the UGBs be able to be more relaxed? Or is that something that, as Oregonians, we should just accept?
So that's a great question. I've lived in Central Oregon for almost 6 years now, and so I'm relatively new, but I did move here from California. Where I've worked in 13 other states for home building before I had the opportunity to come here. And land use in Oregon is super weird, you know, and I don't want to keep that part weird, right? And so that I think we have to ask the state to figure out how to let us add housing. So last night I asked the consultant at the Redmond Housing Needs Analysis meeting, would it be legal for the city of Redmond to expand sooner so that more land were available so that we didn't restrict supply the way we have? And you're shaking your head. The answer is no. It is illegal for the cities to grow fast enough to actually lower housing cost, which is heartbreaking because, yes, in the 70s, it made sense, right? I think some of the things that make our cities in Oregon so cool is the fact that we don't have suburban sprawl. On the other hand, we are now in 2019. You know, Oregon is one of the fastest growing states. In-migration here is huge. It's going to grow one way or another, right? And everyone who is already here would like to be able to stay if that's what they want to do. And I think we should and we must talk to the state about what that is. And I'm a newbie. I don't know what I'm talking about, right? But I think that the opportunity for cities to manage their own growth would then allow the residents of those cities to feel like they have more control over the cost of housing because we could impact the supply faster.
Anyone else on the panel?
I guess two things I think are really important to acknowledge in this conversation. A UGB restricting the supply of land adds an increment of cost. It just does, and it doesn't serve anybody to pretend otherwise. At the same time, I think people who came to Oregon from somewhere else or people who've grown up here and love this state love it for a reason. And my wife grew up in Dallas, Texas, and we fly back to Dallas. I see a landscape that looks really different than this one, where they just build new stuff on the edge of the old stuff, and they just keep going. And I think most of us don't want to live in an environment like that. And two other points I'd make about the UGB, and I guess the other three. One, other really important one is there may be cities in Oregon where the UGB really needs to be expanded, and maybe Bend is one of those. I don't know enough about Bend to say. So I think there's room for a real grown-up, down-to-earth conversation about that. But I look at the Portland UGB, and there are all kinds of green fields that you could build on where the market's just not there, and it's completely allowable right now. You can go to downtown Gresham, 3 blocks from a light rail station, and the market's not supporting development there. So blowing out the UGB in eastern Multnomah County is not going to get you free housing. And there are lots of cities around the country that don't have urban growth boundaries, and housing's really expensive. So it's not a magical solution.
Isn't this the classic urban-rural discussion in Oregon? And I think it's about how do we find a new way to have a discussion that doesn't end up as identity politics. So normally this discussion has sort of ended up with one side being pro-density and the other side being anti-density. And recognizing that we need a more nuanced solution that I would say doesn't go as far as allowing cities to write their own rules, that there is a state standard, but that state standard recognizes needs that the current state standard doesn't recognize. And trying to find that sort of opportunity for a discussion, I think, is really the path that I'd like to see forward.
One more question.
I'm Jacob Clark with Bend Redmond Habitat. We recently merged. And I guess my question speaks to the development side of affordable housing. traditionally, we've been builders of single-family homes. Once the land reaches affordable housing, it's been value added and it's out of our price point. We're not looking at a profit margin, we're trying to reduce our loss. And so we've gone into development. Most of our funding is tied to addresses, but it doesn't do the debt carry of raw land through the infrastructure, the land use, the site improvement, and the time it takes to carry that. So we cash flow that out of pocket, which means our scope is reduced in order to keep cash flow going. Is there a funding out there that lets affordable home builders also take on the development aspect so we save in the value added part before the land reaches us? I guess would be the primary question. And then I'm curious, Jeff, on the time frame from land use application to first building permit getting pulled and how long that debt carry lasts in the city of Bend.
I'll also do the last question first. I like that approach. It's taking over a year in the city of Bend right now between land use and then construction drawings to get it to a point, and then it's another 5 months to the first revenue point. So you've illustrated the thing where there are very often 7 figures spent before the first single revenue point happens, and that is obviously built into the model, but it's risky because we all know what happened. I remember the summer of 08, July-ish, thinking, I think we're about done with this thing now. And then Bear Stearns, and then everything went really bad, right? And so if you had a project in there, we can see some of those lots are still around. The question about the underground development, the raw land acquisition part, I think that we're starting to see the market move to both either joint ventures or land bankers who will take a return, but not until you buy the lot from them. And so the math that is involved there is somewhat complicated, but it's cost, internal rate of return, and then it creates a margin for them, and that's their business, and your business is like our business, which is mostly on the vertical side, and it allows you to put that, what the lot cost is essentially as soon as you know what your development cost is, but it's their money that you're spending until you buy the lot, if that makes sense. But that's double-digit return for the land banker, not 4% for a construction loan.
We have one final question. We have time? Yes. Okay. You're good to go. You're the last. And could you stand up?
So Don Palmier, and the question I have is, do you think the opportunity zones will create some opportunities for your organizations and creating some additional supply?
Very briefly, one of the new pilot projects we just funded with the Million Months Challenge, which was our last attempt to fund some cost-efficient innovation, Bridge Housing, which is a very large affordable housing provider based in California that's now working in Oregon, came in with a proposal to really solve that puzzle of how do you couple opportunity zones and affordable housing. So they're going to take a run at that, and we're going to learn what they find out and share that with other folks. So that's about as much as I know about opportunity zones right now.
Okay, so do you have it? I have one final question. So we have talked about a lot of, we deal with housing every day in our offices in the city of Bend, probably more than you ever know. We really are trying to solve this problem. And we've heard about great ideas, but I'm wondering from the panelists, from your experience, are there private sector-based solutions that haven't been discussed that we should continue exploring after this session and beyond?
I guess I'll start. We think a lot about the financing side of our business and the availability of financing for homeowners because we believe that's one of the keys to unlocking the development of ADUs. If homeowners are walking around with the availability of cash like we do for single-family mortgages, you would see a more robust ADU market. And so in addition to lenders trying to get out of the box, doing things, we're seeing companies that are doing these shared appreciation loans or investments. There's, so there's a company called Point that we just started working with, and they basically write you a check, and they're making an equity investment in your house. And so it's like a home equity loan, but it's not, there's no repayment required, and so they're along for the ride with you. And then on the down payment side, it's a little bit removed from ADUs, but it does relate to homeowners getting into homeownership. There's a company in California called Landed that is doing down payment assistance, and they actually have a focused customer base. They're trying to focus on the type of customers that Stan's talking about. So we're talking about folks who should own homes but can't afford the down payment. So firemen, policemen, and teachers and nurses. And so they're trying to focus on that segment and trying to create a model that, it sounds a lot like what you're doing, because they're trying to hit a sweet spot for investors just minimally, but be able to provide a product that works for homeowners who aren't buying, kind of homes right in the middle of the price range. So I think there's a ton of innovation going on around that. We all know houses, properties are an asset. They typically, over time, appreciate. They go up and down, and we've left too many people out, and so there should be business models built around this, the difference between what assets cost and what incomes the typical person has. There's a mismatch there, but we should be able to close that gap.
It's working? Yeah, I never trust it. I was going to mention Landed. Can I build on some other things? It's a great program. You can find it at landed.com. They've now gone beyond California. They're in Seattle, and they're focused on those communities where there's a big spread, where housing is highly expensive. And to my knowledge, they're entirely focused on school teachers. And the difference between our concept and theirs is that they're matching the down payment. So you have to have somebody who has already earned enough for at least part of the down payment, and then they're matching it. But it's a great program, and we'd love to work together with them, us getting people the first part up, and then coupling with a program like theirs. They were initially philanthropically funded with their initial capital, but then all of their new capital is coming from their sharing in the sales of the houses or the refinancing. The expectation is that the homeowner will take them out in 10 years with a refi or something. The other thing I'd mention is that Craft 3 is here in Bend, and they are now experimenting with a ADU financing program initially in Multnomah County, but would certainly be open to bringing it here. And it's specifically focused on the ability to not have people have any association with the primary mortgage and independently finance it. And they are aligned with the idea of seeing ADUs add to supply, but also hopefully reach people other than just vacation rentals. But we'll see how that plays out.
A couple things that I'd throw into the mix here. I wouldn't write off manufactured homes, what we used to call mobile homes, they are not your granddad's mobile home anymore. And right now, I understand it's a bit challenging. I know the local housing authority here looked really hard at developing a new manufactured home rental community, and it just didn't pencil, partly because of some things going on in the market right this minute. But I think that's a tool, especially for rural communities around Oregon, that's worth coming back to. There's going to be a national conference on manufactured housing in Portland in November. If that's an issue you're interested in, come talk to me. I think the other thing that we're seeing a lot of energy around is trying to leverage savings from future cost avoidance, basically. So things like super high energy efficient homes. We funded a pilot with Housing Development Center and a outfit out of New England called Vermont Energy Investment Corp. to do zero energy modular housing as a rural workforce concept. And if they can really get that off the ground, they can tap into some incentives around energy efficiency and bring that price point down to a place where people can actually buy a home. And then I think the other place where you see that cost-saving sort of conversation happening that's really encouraging is the medical interests around the state, including the CCOs, and I think the one in Central Oregon here, those folks are really into this conversation about how do we help the most vulnerable people stay out of the emergency room, not cycle through our hospital all the time. That might save us $1 million. Is there a way to capture a little slice of that, keep people housed and safe and warm and comfortable, and can they be part of the solution? So I'm seeing that conversation take off really in every corner of the state, and that's really exciting.
Two final thoughts. One is go ahead and look up the Ivory Prize. Ivory Homes in Utah has set aside a couple $100,000 a year to give to between 2 and 4 disruptors and innovators in housing finance, housing construction. They just announced the 2019 winners. Some fascinating stuff around homes that literally can grow with you, where you start with this and then you go to this and then you go up and then you go back down when your kids move out. Fascinating stuff that, you know, remember in 2005 we didn't think this would be a thing, so it'll be here soon. And then my second shameless plug of the night is First Story is our 501c3 nonprofit that we founded 20 years ago. And what we do with First Story is we use 100% private funds, and we offer 0 down, 0% mortgages to families that wouldn't otherwise be able to purchase a home. We build them a professionally built Hayden home, and they buy it at a market rate, and then they share in the equity growth. And when they're ready to sell it, they take their equity. We've built them wealth, and they move into their next home. Then First Story takes the home back, rehabs it, and grants it to yet another family. So we have a homegrown solution here in Central Oregon that we can all participate in, because you don't have to buy a Hayden home to be a supporter of First Story. And we've got millions of dollars worth of assets out there that we've made a difference with. So I'm proud to be part of that.
Great. Thank you. Let's give them a round of applause. And also, I want to thank Carolyn Egan for moderating the panel. Can everybody thank her with me? So the story doesn't end here. The story continues. There are so many other things that are happening out in the market as far as the finance goes. I know there's some people in the audience tonight that are building tiny homes, doing cottage villages. There are a lot of ideas, even on the finance side. There's a company called Unison out of San Francisco, and what they do is they say, hi, Jody, you want to build buy a $500,000 house and you have enough for 10%. I'm going to give you the rest so you can have 20% to lower your monthly nut and be able to afford this home you want, but you don't have to pay me back until you sell the home, because they have long-term investors that can hold that money until you sell, and then you share the equity with the investor for your down payment. That's just one of many, many different tools that are out there. And why I'm bringing this up is because that's the whole point of the evening, is to talk about the cool stuff that's being pushed out there. And to steer you toward, on the Ben Chambers site, we put together a small amount, but it's the tip of the iceberg, but a good start on some resources that are out there on who's doing different types of financing, what types of different models, what employer-funded equity housing projects are out there, a whole bunch of different ideas. Feel free to go to our website. We've got on a piece of paper out here if you want to take one of those home with you and generate some conversations. Let's think about the things that we can do together out there to solve this problem. So, the Blazer score is 36-44. Warriors are ahead, boo. But you know, you gotta wait till the second half with those guys. So that's your little update. I do have a few other things. Leila, where are you? Stand up. Leila Owen, are you still here? There she is. Leila Owen is the brand new member of the Chamber of Commerce staff. She is our new investment manager. Sorry. And she starts tomorrow, and we're so thrilled. We got her from Hum Kombucha, and we're so happy that she's joining us. So you will see a lot of Leila in the future. Plates is my next note. If you have a plate under your chair, the staff here would greatly appreciate it if you could just put it on the bar or on the side so they can pick it up, because they sweep around and pick up the chairs. And the final thing of the night is just a call to action. And again, let's generate some conversations. Please approach these folks. They traveled, some of them from Portland and other places, to get here tonight. And let's generate more conversation in our community. How do we resolve this housing crisis by using a lot of different tools? I thank you for coming tonight, and we'll see you next month. Thanks.